Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope you're safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, 4 perspectives on the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you believe Haaretz's military correspondent Amos Harel, the last 4 months, January to May of this year, have been among the quietest in years in terms of conflict and violence between Israelis and Palestinians. And now this. So much for the notion of the unsustainable, sustainable status quo. We're now watching a multi-dimensional conflict playing out along 3 fronts, perhaps 4, if you would include the West Bank, although things have quieted down on some of these fronts. Tensions in Jerusalem, Hamas-Israeli cross-border engagement and war, an unprecedented communal conflict between Arab and Jewish citizens not seen since the pre-state period. The whys, the hows, the what next about this situation are very complex and open to interpretation and to analysis, despite the ever-present and unavoidable reality from the perspective of those who are in conflict, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been turned into a kind of morality play, pitting the forces of good versus evil on one hand, right versus wrong on the other. We hope today that, as difficult as it may be, always keeping in mind the importance of clarity and honesty in analysis, that we can inject some nuance, some perspective, and context into the discussion. Even though many on both sides seem to believe that simplifying matters makes more sense. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complicated. It's not one hand clapping. Perhaps it best fits Goethe's definition of tragedy. Competing justices where the core needs of both need to be somehow impossibly reconciled. And we should never, ever forget that above all, this is not about political analysis. It's a human story and a tragic one. More than 200 Palestinians have been killed, a quarter of them children. On the Israeli side, 12 or 13 have died. There are many questions. What were the immediate triggers of the conflict, and what's the broader context in which it's taking place? What's new about this conflict versus what's been entrenched from previous rounds? What are the likely consequences for Israel, for Hamas, once the shooting stops, and it will, for Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and what remains of the options for any kind of political process? What do we make of the communal violence between Israeli Arabs and Jews, both citizens of the state? And what does it portend for society and state in Israel? And what of Jerusalem? Perhaps more central now than ever before. Our previous president suggested that Jerusalem was now off the table. It seems to me that Jerusalem, frankly, has now become the table. And what are the external players? Who counts and who doesn't? And finally, what about the Biden administration? Fortunately for me, I do not have to answer any of these questions today. But we have 4 extraordinary panelists who can. I have known them all for years. Agree or disagree? Their analysis is informed by life experiences, immersed in Middle East politics, in American politics, in diplomacy, and sadly, in conflict. Let me introduce them quickly. Daniel Kurtzer is a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and Israel and current S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. He also served as a speechwriter and member of the Secretary of State George Shultz's policy planning staff, as well as serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR. Tzipi Livini is the former Vice Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Justice. She served as a member of the Israeli National Security Cabinet and was Israel's chief negotiator for peace between Israel and the Palestinians during the last 2 rounds in 2008 and 2013. Khalil Shikaki is a professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, PSR, in Ramallah. He is also a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis and co-founder of the Arab Barometer and the Arab Reform Initiative, co-author as well of the annual report on Arab Democracy Index. Since '93, he's conducted hundreds of polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. And since 2000, dozens of interviews and polls among Israelis. Marwan Mouasher is currently my colleague and a vice president for studies at Carnegie, where he oversees research in Washington and Beirut on the Middle East. In '95, Marwan opened Jordan's first embassy in Israel, and in '96, he became Minister of Information and Government spokesperson. From '97 to 2002, he served in Washington again as ambassador, negotiating the first free trade agreement between the United States and an Arab nation. He then returned to Jordan to serve as foreign minister, where he played a central role in developing the Arab Peace Initiative and the Middle East Roadmap. To all of you who are familiar with Carnegie Connects, the format is pretty simple. Each panelist will speak for no more than 5 minutes. They'll turn it over to me. I'll ask a round of annoying questions of all of them, and we'll have a discussion. So, Khalil, can I turn the virtual and one day, hopefully, the real floor over to you? It'd be great to see you again in person.
Thank you, Aaron. It would be great to see you too. I want to start with something that I hope and I think Dan will probably talk more about, and that is, why is the U.S. allowing this aimless violence to continue? Reasons that are really not clear. It is blocking international efforts to call for a ceasefire. And I think this is something that I hope Dan will talk more about. It's certainly very puzzling what the U.S. is doing, and it is very damaging because in the last few months, we have, since the election of Biden, we have seen significant optimism among Palestinians regarding the new administration. And I think what is now happening is essentially helping to diminish that optimism regarding a future role for the U.S. administration. The second point I want to make is that in terms of the overall aspect of this conflict, two things I believe emerge. One is that it definitely is not planned. It wasn't planned by Hamas. It wasn't planned by Israel. A month ago, this was unthinkable, and it then happens. 2 weeks ago, the process was underway. I'll talk more about this in a minute. Thirdly, or secondly, the domestic dynamics have, in this case, have been on the Palestinian side in particular, have been extremely important in terms of affecting decisions regarding this violence. So why now? The obvious answer, of course, is that Israel had done something during the month of Ramadan that affected Muslim holy places. It affected the city. It affected Sheikh Jarrah, the demographic, territorial dimension of Jerusalem. The decisions that Israel made, restricting access to the holy places, evicting or threatening to evict residents in Sheikh Jarrah, have essentially created conditions for confrontations in East Jerusalem. These confrontations did not need to become a war, but they did because of a second dynamic, and that is Israel's decision not to allow the planned Palestinian elections to take place in East Jerusalem. It has obligations to do so. It has done so already 3 times in the past, and this time Israel decided not to allow these elections to take place. The third dynamic attack has been Abbas's own decision to cancel these elections. Abbas claimed that the cancellation came in response to the Israeli denial of permission to allow the elections in East Jerusalem. Almost everybody else knows that this was not the reason why he canceled the elections. He canceled the elections because he was going to lose the presidential elections, and Fatah wasn't going to be able to control the parliament without having to create a coalition with some of its own defectors. That would have weakened the control of Fatah and Abbas over the parliament. But the fourth dynamic actually came from Hamas, from within Hamas. Hamas's inability to forge an alliance against Abbas's election decision. That failure essentially forced Hamas into the corner. All the others in this election wanted to work against Abbas, but they didn't want to do so under Hamas's leadership. Within Hamas, the cancellation of the election, of course, dealt a heavy blow to a strategy that they have built that sought to restore the organization's legitimacy and free itself from the burden of governing the Gaza Strip. And that would have been done if Hamas was able to reintegrate itself into the formal political process. Hamas did not unleash the current confrontations, it simply capitalized on them to make the case for replacing Abbas's leadership. Israel's decision to prevent the elections in East Jerusalem gave Abbas a reason to cancel an election which he now, in fact, didn't want anyway. But that decision impacted the domestic Palestinian environment in a manner that Israel did not anticipate. It led to war with Hamas. If elections went ahead as planned, there would not have been a war. East Jerusalem confrontations would probably have escalated and intensified, but it would have remained essentially a non-violent confrontation. Seeking a greater share of the popular vote, Hamas, Fatah, and all the others would have been too busy competing in the elections, in the election campaign by mobilizing themselves in the city against the Israeli police and extremist settlers. Hamas would not have risked a war in Gaza that would have halted the preparations for elections, thereby destroying its opportunities to reintegrate itself into the formal Palestinian political process. But without elections, the stage for a confrontation was set, with East Jerusalem measures essentially providing the background for Hamas's military response. The ramifications, I believe, are clear. Domestically, it will most likely end with Hamas emerging relatively stronger, regardless of what happens in the military field. The Palestinian Authority and Abbas weaker. The flames of conflict between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, I believe, obviously the flames will go down, and they have already. But the search for equality will begin to take a new shape. Perhaps some will reach the conclusion that that search is inherently futile. This realization might have a negative impact among those Palestinians who call for a one-state solution. The role of Jerusalem, as Aaron has said, and its holy places in this case, will most likely gain greater prominence, and its contribution to conflict escalation will probably continue to grow. Finally, the realization among Palestinians, and I think also Israelis as well, perhaps even among many in the international community, will be stronger that for the foreseeable future, the search for a peaceful means of ending the conflict could probably have come to the end of the road. These conclusions, I believe, should ring an alarm, both in Washington and elsewhere. Something needs to be done to reverse all these negative tendencies at a time when it seems the international community, and in fact the region, is busy doing many other things. Thank you.
Khalil, thanks so much. There's a complexity about that analysis that we need to unpack, and I look forward to coming back to you, since you have a terrific sense of both the thinking and the trend lines and the headlines within the Palestinian community. Tzipi, can I turn things over to you now?
Yes, hello. These are difficult times. I hope that in few hours, days, this clash between Israel and Hamas in Gaza will be stopped. Hopefully, we regain either deterrence and also reduce the military power of Hamas. So it's clear that we gain some time, and I believe that the real question is what are we going to do before the next cycle between Israel and Hamas. And I think that this is the responsibility of all the sides that are connected. And when it comes to the Palestinians, I would refer to Hamas, but also to the Palestinian Authority, because we need to look at the situation from a broader perspective. And the real question is, okay, what are we doing? In the past, I had a clear answer. I said that while there is no hope for peace with Hamas, because Hamas represent a religious conflict, they are not willing to end the conflict by establishing a Palestinian state. Therefore, they abuse the situation in Jerusalem in order to take over and represent the religious side of the conflict, while using the fact that also Abu Mazen cancelled, postponed the elections on the Palestinian side. So my answer usually was, okay, let's take the time and use this time in order to negotiate final status peace treaty with the legitimate Palestinian Authority, while Hamas is a terrorist organization. And we tried to do so in the past, since the disengagement from Gaza, because Israel left Gaza Strip, we dismantled the settlements, we pulled out our forces, and the idea was to reach an agreement with the legitimate Palestinian Authority to establish a Palestinian state based on the idea of two states for two peoples and end of conflict. We failed to do so. I negotiated twice. Last round of negotiations was in 2013, 2014, and frankly, Abu Mazen was not willing to give an answer to an American paper that represented mostly all the well-known parameters for peace since Clinton parameters. And now what we are facing is a combination of great weakness of Abu Mazen and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. And frankly, due to the last 4 years in which the Trump administration, it was part of their view. And I don't see now on both sides a situation that would give us hope to reach final status agreement. And we are facing the risk that the conflict would turn into a religious conflict. And as was mentioned before, it infiltrated into Israel as well. And what we saw in the last few days within Israel, between Jews and Muslims and Arabs, is something that tells us that without giving a solution, without embracing and hopefully translating it into reality, the idea of two states for two peoples, we are going to face the conflict. It's a kind of a sample of what does it, how a binational state look like. And if this would be between Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea, we are doomed. And therefore, the real question is what can be also the role of Biden administration, any Israeli government, and any leader on the Palestinian side. So since I don't think, realistically, not because I don't want it, since I don't think that, inviting both sides to another Camp David or something, or Annapolis, would create real hope. Therefore, I think that the most important thing is, one, to redefine the GPS of the region and the American policy in terms of two states for two peoples. This is what Biden already did. And keep this door and this road open, reducing the tension, and take some steps or the steps that are needed toward this. And there is another element that can be added, and I want to refer to Abraham Accords and the region and Gulf states, because it is clear, well, as an Israeli, I'm truly happy about Abraham Accords and having peace with Gulf states, but yet it is clear that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was abandoned. And the real question is now, what can be the premises of peace to Israel? Well, I believe that it is an Israeli interest. I believe, especially now after watching the clash within the Israeli streets, that we need to do it. But it was not on the agenda in the last 4 hours of elections. And looking on the Palestinian side, I think that this is also, frankly, the same situation on the Palestinian side as well. So maybe putting the new GPS or the old GPS of 2 states for 2 people is important, then yet taking the steps in order to encourage Palestinians, helping the Palestinian economy, not as a replacement to a real peace, but something that maybe can create or re-engage the Palestinian. And maybe there is also a way to, since we have Abraham Accords referred to, or normalize the relations between Israel and some states, but yet the Saudis are outside of Abraham Accords, and maybe this is the component that can be added not just to Abraham Accords, but something that can push or can be the incentive also for Israel to take steps toward the Palestinians if the Saudis will take steps toward Israel. I'm trying to think, by the way, nothing is new, but there's a need to re-energize something, because otherwise we are deteriorating in a slippery slope without noticing to one state. And one state is against what I believe the interest of Israel. It doesn't represent the national interest of the Palestinians. And this is something that we cannot afford.
Aaron, you're muted. Thanks, Dan. I was saying, Tzipi, I'm glad you're looking forward. I'm glad you're looking, and analysis, which is important, sometimes can lead to paralysis, and that's something we clearly don't want. I want to come back to you during the Q&A and what you mean with respect to redefining the GPS. Marwan, over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. I want to make a few points. First of all, of course, the latest confrontation has resulted in a loss of lives, terrible loss of lives on both sides, Palestinian and Israeli, largely, as you stated, Aaron, on the Palestinian side. But let's be clear, that's not the crux of the issue. The issue is not an Israel-Hamas confrontation. The issue is the occupation. You have an occupation, the longest occupation in modern history that has been going on. So that's the real focus that we need to start the conversation with, in my view. The other point I want to make is that the Oslo framework is done, is gone, is over. You know, I'm a product of the Oslo generation. You all are products of the Oslo generation. But the Oslo generation basically was based on the premise that negotiations were supposed to take place and end in 5 years, that hopefully they would end in 2 states, at least that's what the Palestinians hoped it would end in. And the international community has taken the position that in order for negotiations to take place between Palestinians and Israelis, they looked the other way about gross violations of human rights by Israel, because that was the price to pay to bring Israel to the table. Well, guess what? 30 years later, we don't have an end to the occupation. We don't have a 2-state solution. And violations of human rights cannot be ignored anymore. Is the point I want to make. The issue of rights is assuming center stage now. And Israel is slowly being de-exceptionalized by the international community. You cannot hold Israel, the rest of the world, by some standards and then hold Israel by other standards. That is, in my view, what we are seeing today. The Palestinian youth that we are seeing against the occupation in Jerusalem have lost all hope that they are going to, bring an end to the occupation. Lost hope, not just hope by Israel, but also hope of their own leadership, as Khalil said. And they are taking matters into their own hands, because 30 years later, the vision of hope that they had in their mind is over. I'm a two-stater by training. I'm a one-stater now by reality. The reality today is that we are already in a one-state reality. We're not waiting for that reality. We already are in a one-state reality. The question is becoming increasingly, is this reality going to turn into an apartheid state or into a democratic state? That is the question that is being increasingly asked. And those who keep clinging to the old paradigm of two states have to explain to us how separation of the two communities is going to take place when 700,000 settlers exist in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. It is clear that the Biden administration is not interested in a vision beyond a ceasefire. They might do ad hoc measures here and there, but I think it is clear that the region, aside from Iran, is not a priority for the Biden administration. And so, yes, we will achieve a ceasefire, but then what? I'm afraid, and Tzipi, alluded to this. Tzipi said we will, slip into a one-state situation. We are in a one-state situation. Today, we are in a one-state situation. The other point I want to make is about the Palestinians in Israel, those who hold Israeli citizens. And I think that one main reason why they have erupted in a way that made them look very close to their brethren and cousins in the West Bank under occupation is that they themselves are being treated unequally. Yes, they are citizens of Israel. They're not equal citizens of Israel. And with the basic law, particularly that was passed 2 years ago, that placed Israeli Jews legally above Palestinian Arabs, not de facto, but legally placed them above Palestinian Arabs. I think it is natural that these people are going to say, we're not going to accept a situation in which not only the Palestinians under occupation are being treated unequally, but also we who are supposed to be citizens of Israel are treated unequally too. And I think Israel is going to have a major problem today, not just dealing with the Palestinians under occupation, but dealing with its own citizens. And this issue of unequal rights cannot go on, in my view. Today, Israel is being called, an apartheid state by some. This was unthinkable 5 years ago. It was taboo to even mention the term without being labeled as anti-Semite. Today, an Israeli organization is calling Israel an apartheid state. So we are in a situation, I'm afraid, where I don't see the international community moving. I don't see the United States moving towards a solution. And we are going to be de facto in a one-state reality. And from now on, we need to deal with this fact and see how we can achieve a solution that would satisfy the aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. But I'm afraid that's not going to be done through the old paradigm of two states.
Well, thank you. It's the last three presentations don't leave much political space or room for untethered optimism. But why is that a surprise? Which brings us now to Daniel Kurtzer, who I hope will look at the Biden administration and perhaps suggest some pathways that make sense, that would at least reinstill the sense that there are some things to do that actually may count. Dan, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to my longtime friends for joining this panel. There's a tendency in protracted conflicts, including in the Middle East, for the parties to the conflict to be experts on what the other side is doing or failing to do. And I've always suggested that we all need to look in a mirror and examine what we are doing and failing to do. So I want to take up the challenge of trying to understand what the Biden administration has been doing or has failed to do, and maybe that can help us look forward to what might be done in the days ahead. There are at least 6 factors, I think, that have guided the Biden administration's approach to this particular conflict, but even broader than that, to the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first is the overwhelming burden that this administration has inherited of fixing the United States, of fixing race relations, immigration, infrastructure, our healthcare system, the economy, and of course, COVID. Biden has not only undertaken to try to do that, but I think he has absorbed the idea that he actually can be a transformational president along the lines of Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Depression in the 1930s and beyond. And so in that context, you run into the second approach or second issue on the administration's agenda, which is you can't ignore foreign policy totally, but it's important to set priorities. And this administration has made clear from the outset that its priorities are China, Russia, climate, and to some extent, the immediate issue of trying to get back into the Iran nuclear accord, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Almost anything else becomes what George Shultz used to call tending the garden. In other words, you do have, as a major power, relations with the rest of the world. You have to deal with a lot of other issues. But this administration truly is so absorbed domestically that it has limited bandwidth beyond those core 4 issues that I think they have identified as important. The third, I think, thing to look at in terms of the administration, when it comes to the Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli issue, is the challenge of undoing all of the damage that the Trump administration did. And the reality is that the Trump administration did a tremendous amount of damage to longstanding American policy. And so until this latest crisis broke out, the administration was focused entirely on trying to fix what had been broken by Trump and his associates. How do you restore aid to the Palestinian Authority and to the UN Relief and Works Agency that deals with Palestinian refugees? How do you restore dialogue and communications with the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority? How do you put Jerusalem back on the table when the Trump administration, as Aaron noted earlier, had taken it off the table? And so this was a full-time job for Deputy Assistant Secretary Hadi Amr, which points to the fourth problem, is that there's been an absence of people, of officials dealing with this issue. Only recently did we get a Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman. Only recently did we get an Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. We don't have an Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. We don't have an ambassador in Israel. And because the Consulate General in Jerusalem was shut down, we don't have a Consul General. And so the only person in the administration actively working on this for the last 4 or 5 months has been a Deputy Assistant Secretary. And having been a Deputy Assistant Secretary, I know how exalted a position it is, but I also know its limitations. You can't do the heavy lifting of what a secretary or undersecretary or even assistant secretary has to do as a Deputy Assistant Secretary. The fifth issue, I think, which is critical to look at, is the administration, I think, did understand the difference between 2014 and 2021. In other words, what prompted the outbreak of violence in 2014 was almost entirely an Israel-Hamas problem. Hamas demanding the lifting of the Israeli blockade, Israel demanding Hamas stop firing rockets and maintain calm. And an escalation spiral began in 2014 that got out of hand, and you ended up with a 50-plus day war. As we know from the earlier discussion today, 2021 is very different. It started differently. It started in Jerusalem, and it has motivated Arab and Muslim ranks in a way that 2014 never did. And so the challenge then is not just dealing with a ceasefire. Of course you want a ceasefire, but the challenge is, how do you get back to the underlying issues, Jerusalem, and as Marwan suggested, the occupation? And finally, I would note as a sixth factor is domestic politics. All eyes are on 2022 in the United States because we have a divided country. We have an almost 50-50 split in both the Senate and the House. And the most vulnerable people in 2022 are not the Republicans and not the progressives. They are the mainstream Democrats who are trying to straddle both sides of this issue to express their support for Israel, Israel's right of self-defense, while also saying to Israel, you can't do what you've been doing in the bombing of Gaza that's led to so many casualties. And the net result of these six factors is there's no policy. So just looking ahead for 30 more seconds, can there be a policy? Well, sure. First of all, you've got to get to that ceasefire, but then the administration has to pivot immediately, working with others, the Arab Quartet, the International Quartet, the so-called Munich Group, to try to deal with more of the underlying issues, the discrimination and biases against Palestinians in the West Bank, the problems of the dispossession of Palestinians and the eviction of Palestinians from their homes in Jerusalem, the lawlessness of extremist settlers, the challenge of authoritarian rule in the West Bank and the absence of elections. In other words, there's an agenda short of a major peace process initiative that this administration can turn to while also focusing on the large transformational domestic agenda that clearly is Biden's priority.
Dan, thanks so much. I'm reminded that Charlie Cook has looked at every incumbent's party since 1946. The average loss in the first midterms of an incumbent's party is 22 seats in the House and 3 seats in the Senate. The next several months between now and July are going to be critically important to the administration's efforts to pass its jobs/infrastructure bill. So you're quite right to tether all of this to the importance of domestic politics. And let me begin with domestic politics in a way. You know, Tip O'Neill argued that all politics are local. So let me start with Khalil. If you had to identify what winning means for Hamas, since they are one of the two major protagonists in this, the PA and Abbas is important, but not central to this piece of the conflict. Where are the gains that will actually last, do you think?
Most importantly, I think what Hamas hopes that this will lead to is a realization among the Palestinians that Abbas and the Palestinian National Movement, Fatah, are no longer the leaders of the Palestinian people or the efforts to end the Israeli occupation, that Hamas and Hamas's strategy, Hamas's way, is the way to move forward. If it is able to convey this message to the Palestinian public, and I think Hamas is doing a very good job with that, then that is Hamas's greatest achievement. Abbas's decision to cancel the elections has provided Hamas with that opportunity. There is an overwhelming majority of the Palestinians that disliked that decision, sided with Hamas in the demand for elections. The use of Jerusalem is the second issue. Hamas needs to be seen out of this as the defender of Jerusalem, the defender of holy places. And in that too, Hamas's narrative has been highly successful. A ceasefire, even if it does not end with an agreement on holy places or Sheikh Jarrah, is still a victory for Hamas because it sends a message to the Israelis that there's a cost for tampering with the situation with regard to holy places and Sheikh Jarrah, and that violence can come back. There is, of course, an overwhelming majority of the Palestinians who side with the view that what Israel is doing in the holy places and in Sheikh Jarrah is an attempt to force the Palestinians in the corner, and that the Palestinians therefore have a right. What Hamas did in terms of resort to sending rockets into Israel is something that is surprisingly supported by a very large majority of the Palestinians, that there is a need to send a message to Israel that Israel will not be able to get away with this anymore. This is a very strong message, and it resonates with the Palestinians very much. That is another definition of victory for Hamas.
Thanks, Khalil. You poll for a living, and I realize it's difficult during a hot conflict to conduct a lot of deep research on attitudes, but I think I know the answer here. If elections were to be held, one of the things Dan and I argued in a recent article is that we should encourage Mahmoud Abbas to hold elections. If elections were held today, what would the outcome be?
Well, elections are not going to be held today under the current conditions, but elections were supposed to take place on the 22nd, 2 days from now, of May. And had those elections taken place, let's for a minute omit this war. Had elections taken place at